Hello everyone, my name is Ian Garcia, this is Devotional Criticism, and welcome back to the New Movie Diary. This is a cinema criticism series in which I review recent, new, and up-and-coming film releases and attempt to give you the straight facts about them, in my humble opinion. And last 4th of July weekend, I finally bit the bullet and went to see Jackass Best and Last, the latest and apparently finally genuine conclusion to the illustrious Jackass franchise that first started all the way back in the year 2000 when MTV first broadcast the pilot for a lo-fi, fairly shoddily produced sketch comedy series that depicted a bunch of stereotypical 20 to 30-something white slackers, skaters, and party boys executing public pranks and stunts, none of which were necessarily new to either sketch comedy or the still rather nascent reality TV of the period, but where Jackass stood out is that, true to its name, these pranks and stunts were often very immature, irresponsible, or just downright repulsive and masochistic. From the very beginning, the first largely teenage and college-age viewers of Jackass were seeing not just trendy, edgy, but still FCC-safe youth culture performed by camera-ready personalities. They were seeing a bunch of gross, weird guys tasing each other, intentionally hurting or injuring themselves or each other for comic effect, with the coup de grace being one cast member, Steve-O, being strapped into a porta potty, which was then rigged to the forklift of a garbage truck, and then being lifted into the air and upside down so that he was covered in his own recent feces, and, of course, also then vomited on himself. Jackass was the brainchild, if you could call it that, of producer and director Jeff Tremaine, failed actor Johnny Knoxville, and music video director Spike Jonze, the latter of whose credits to the production and sometimes even participation in the sketches for Jackass's first official season probably came as quite a shock to the entertainment and critical community that had just been heaping laurels on Jonze 2 years prior for his debut feature film collaboration with writer Charlie Kaufman, being John Malkovich. In fact, by the time that Tremaine, Knoxville, and Jonze were ready to take Jackass away from the more sensorial television to the R-rated silver screen for the first Jackass movie in 2002, Jonze and Kaufman were ready to save face for the critics yet again with Adaptation later that same year. Now, that's a crazy double feature for you. I wasn't there for Jackass when Johnny Knoxville first got fired out of a cannon into a safety net in the opening of the pilot. I was barely 9 years old, and for some years after that, Jackass was only something that I was aware of, but never really bothered to sneak around to watch. I didn't have much use for MTV in those days. I liked cartoons and Godzilla movies. It wasn't until I was already in college that I even felt any kind of temptation to watch Jackass, and by that point I could simply order Jackass number 2 from Netflix. I genuinely had not even bothered to watch any of the show or the first movie. And I suppose the reason it must have taken me so long to get to the point, and the reason I settled on that, is that I think my very first really impressionable experience of Jackass was for a TV spot for the second Jackass movie back in 2005, in which, incredibly clever publicity pull here, this franchise that had obviously aroused harsh reaction and controversy from the very beginning was now actually getting some considerably positive reviews for their second feature film, with the conclusion of the TV spot being the narrator saying, "We can't believe it either." So by the time that I was finally getting around to watching Jackass number 2 years after I had seen that TV spot, not only had the public scandal about the original Jackass TV run long settled as just another blip culture war controversy, better publicity than anything else as it always is, but the critical consideration and reception of the series had considerably improved. Besides the fact that the production value of the films was way better than anything they could accomplish with the original series, now what most critics were observing with Jackass, whether they personally liked it or not, whether they found any of this funny or even necessarily productive to the tastes of its audience, what they were finding was instead a fascination, even a sympathy, with this strange group of characters who Tremaine had basically collected from the underground skater and music scene scene. Knoxville and Steve-O, of course, but also Bam Margera, Chris Pontius, Ryan Dunn, Dave England, Aaron McGeehee, Preston Lacey, Jason Weeman Acuna. Regardless of whatever might have occurred behind the scenes at various points in this journey, the forward-facing brand of Jackass became that beneath all of the revolting and even downright demeaning stuff that these guys would do to each other, at the constant instigating and encouragement of Tremaine and Knoxville, of course, beneath all of that was a deep fraternal bond, that this was gross playground and fraternity boy behavior pushed to its most extreme, with the irony, especially becoming by Jackass number 2, that what you were witnessing was not a regressive presentation of masculinity at all, but rather a very sincere and downright intimate depiction of male bonding. By the time that I saw Jackass number 2, again years after it had already come and gone, and to the best of everybody's knowledge at that point, that was the last hurrah for Jackass aside from sundry TV specials and spin-off series. I had basically been passively primed to see exactly that, because the movie I saw was not a lo-fi, shoddy piece of work. It literally opened with an elaborate action sequence in which the cast were chased through the streets of some studio suburb backlot and inevitably hammered by a stampede of bulls, and then the movie ended with a musical number. Besides the fact that its lowbrow humor certainly appealed to my taste, it was an objectively well-produced and original movie. Somehow part gross-out teen comedy and documentary, and throughout it, no matter what painful stunt or demeaning experience these guys were put through by others in the cast, everybody got their licks, everybody participated, and more so than that, Knoxville didn't simply instigate. He took it upon himself to make sure that he always eventually got it the worst, that he did the most potentially life-threatening stunt, that he gave it to himself way worse than he expected his friends to just take it. The cast of Jackass could participate in some demeaning sketches and stunts, but at least among the main cast, there was never the perception that anybody was being bullied, even to the degree that so many of the stunts and sketches relied on some degree of nudity, including very graphic genital and anal exposure, and sometimes abuse. If someone has to drop their pants in Jackass, it's usually not a good thing. There was always this hearty sense, not just of tough, rugged guys testing their limits, but really to the exact opposite effect of a bunch of otherwise soft, vulnerable dudes who always came back together and seemed more like they were getting something out of using these stunts and sketches to show that they were not tough guys, that they were jokes, that even pretending to be some kind of tough guy, that's the real Jackass. A not insignificant number of people inevitably pinpointed the homoerotic subtext of a lot of what Knoxville in particular was staging. Jackass number 2 really is the most bold and true formulation of what his evolving vision for the franchise likely was, which was not just gross-out reality TV, but where he became the ringleader of a circus that increasingly sought less to provoke or antagonize people, but to rather put on a macho costume that constantly makes fun of and exposes itself, figuratively and literally. The whole testing your grit part is just a setup. The purpose is to provide the primarily disconnected, usually white male audience with some safely costumed reprieve from being afraid of looking weak, or looking gay, or looking like you're the butt of the joke. The more embarrassed and defeated and naked these guys become, they only become the more close and loving of one another, so that by Jackass number 2, Knoxville and Tremaine are already stripping away the pretense of any subtext and making their closing musical number the best of times from the musical adaptation of La Cage aux Folles, which is a musical comedy about a gay couple that tries and hilariously fails to hide just how gay they are in an attempt to win the favor of an uptight, traditionally masculine and straight moral crusader. They knew what they were doing, and even as a pretty isolated college freshman who had never really found any kind kind of fun-loving, adventurous social bond with a group of same-age guys like that before, I knew that they knew what they were doing. Jackass number 2 really was the peak of the franchise. It's an absolutely hilarious spectacle if you have shamelessly gross, visceral tastes. The stunts are exciting, they get nerve-wracking at times, but it also, at least from my, again, quite isolated perspective, clearly serviced in a way that a traditional comedy about gross, dumb guys couldn't, the escapist desire for that kind of joined-at-the-hip, intimate male bonding without fear of judgment, even when taken to the extreme of self-debasing absurdity. It's weird looking back on Jackass in our times now, where there is so much overemphasis placed on the apparent epidemic of male loneliness, because the core popularity of Jackass has clearly always been driven not by some universal perception or condition of male friendship or camaraderie or socially constructed male-dominated structures. The idea that contemporary critics took for granted, which is just that this is just the way guys are, boys will be boys, this is it all boiled down to its most base. I have a strong feeling that even part of the reason that each successive Jackass movie, none of which were as good as Jackass number 2, the reason they each received demonstrably more charitable and even positive reactions from mainstream film and media publications is precisely because a lot of more isolated, risk-averse, nerdy guys grew up and carried with them a much more fundamental identification with Jackass as a fantasy of male intimacy without judgment, without fear of being called out as not really fitting a lot of hegemonic masculine traits, that fear of rejection and emphasis on individual achievement, that not showing of fear and pain. The Jackass crew deliberately put themselves through pain and fear so everybody could see it. The fear of showing the exact sorts of extreme emotional swings, or even a sublimated queerness that I think it's safe to say is an impediment to a lot of, and a growing number of, boys and younger men from even scratching the surface of that kind of intimate, non-judgmental, physically affective bond with another boy or younger man, if not multiple ones at the same time. Like, it's a party. Everybody get into the big old gay pile of poo and if Jackass number 2 is great, what makes it not just an incredibly funny comedy, but a truly fascinating and unique documentary movie, it's because it just so intuitively channeled what the predominant condition of lots of boys and younger men actually was, which was loneliness, a lack of physical reinforcement of loving bonds between each other. Jackass doesn't represent the epitome of boys will be boys. The whole point is that by the social construction of straight white masculinity, these guys who would not just do these stupid things, but do them in such a flamboyant way, these guys are just jackasses. This is common, low behavior they should grow out of. Jackass was successful because, I think, it dug its hooks into an already increasingly disaffected, isolated, atomized, lonely generation of Xer and early millennial boys and younger men who were craving the male bonding that Jackass portrayed, but were frightened to pursue that kind of adventurism and naked intimacy in real life. Behind the scenes, of course, the intimate bonds between these guys was always partially performative, whether it was Tremaine and Knoxville in one camp, bringing on most of the cast from their skater zine days, or Margera and the adjacent CKY crew that were basically scouted by Tremaine into joining the cast. Jackass was a studio creation, with the studio part only playing a bigger role as the film franchise went on and the stunts became even more elaborate set pieces. Whereas as early as the first movie, there were rumblings about cast members not being happy with the pay they were being offered, partying, alcohol, and drug use were constant ingredients of especially Steve-O and Margera's personas, both signaling dark shadows of their real-life substance abuse issues. And while Steve-O was able to get clean and sober for Jackass 3D, within less than a year of that movie coming out, Margera's childhood friend and fellow mainstay Thursday, Ryan Dunn died in a horrific drunk driving crash that also took the life of a production assistant who was his passenger at the time, giving a clue that while the intimacy of the cast and crew's camaraderie might not have been much of an illusion, the actual implications of what some of the most prominent Jackass cast and crew's personal lives were like, the kind of environment that creating this franchise had fostered. Look, when Ryan Dunn died at 34 with a .2 blood alcohol level, effectively becoming the catalyst that would send Margera himself spiraling into self-degenerating addiction to such an extent that he hardly appeared at all in Jackass Forever and only appears in archival footage for Jackass Best and Last. The writing was on the wall for the same generation that grew up with the escapist fantasy of Jackass to grow up ourselves and maybe start to look back on this thing that had modeled a very earnest and compelling vision for us of what masculinity could look like in a more intimate, less judgmental way. And then do a little bit of soul searching about how Jackass itself was always a paradox, and how the same death of Ryan Dunn that has led to his being especially eulogized in both the fourth and now fifth film, depending on how you're counting. Jackass Best and Last is already the third last movie in the franchise. That same breakup, that same interference of real life into art means we have to acknowledge that Jackass also was, and always was, a humiliation ritual, a constant humiliation ritual, and for the better part of half the franchise's run, drugs and alcohol were clearly the medicine for dealing with what that willingness to take a bad paycheck, to pretend to be such good friends with these guys that you mostly only know through being employed to be friends, a crew, to do all of these injurious things, this masochism, this self-harm, and to actually just keep repressing those deep feelings of lack and depression and disaffection that underwrote Steve-O's addiction, Dunn's addiction, Margera's addiction. The drugs and alcohol were the medicine for that humiliation ritual. Even if Jackass has run a clean and sober set for the past 3 films, there's no getting around the inherent cynical ick of its continuing to go on without Dunn by necessity or Margera by consequence. Jackass Forever didn't need to just be underwhelming for me as some kind of equally cynical and misconceived attempt to frame the film around Knoxville effectively passing the torch to a new generation of stupid thrill seekers from the era of YouTube and social media content creation, none of whom have the same comedic timing and screen presence of their more seasoned, older cast, whose reactions to the stunts and pranks are honestly so boring that they kind of made me too self-aware that pretty much everyone from Knoxville to McGehee to England are professionals in the sense that they have just kind of intuitively learned to lock into the bit and play up their reactions for the camera. Even for all of that, because what sort of torch is being passed here? Jackass Forever, for however funny and creative some of its bits still are, is haunted rather than blessed by the spirit of Ryan Dunn. Knoxville can make all the self-aware jokes he wants, but it really isn't an exaggeration to say that the only people left in Jackass really did survive the franchise. They wouldn't be here without it as a force in their lives, but it's impossible for me as just an older guy looking back and reckoning with what that kind of environment of constant excess and humiliation and pain spoke to and affected in the people who participated in it. And how it is probably about time that we, as fans of Jackass, dare I say it, as admirers of Jackass as not just a funny series, but as once truly discursive and inventive physical comedic art, it's time for us, instead of taking the safe way out, instead of passing the torch and burden onto another generation of lonely, disaffected boys and younger men desperately seeking that same fantasy promise of true intimacy and bonding and fearlessness in the face of discomfort, we need to be able to look back on our history, our moment, and say, yes, Jackass has just kind of gone the way of that old road, where you just say, this was important for its time, but it was hindered by its time. It was historically contingent too. Take the good with the bad. We're not perfect. We were just figuring things out. You, the next generation, don't try to be like us. Don't try to join the cast. Don't try to be a part of the team. Go forth. Find your own thing. Do better than we did. Learn more from our mistakes than from our successes. Jesus Christ, I've been talking for nearly half an hour and I haven't even really talked about Jackass Best and Last. So do I even need to talk about Jackass Best and Last? Look, if you like Jackass Forever, if you just like taking a trip down memory lane with the gang and you just want to see what other kinds of sketches and stunts and premises these elder statesmen of a pretty groundbreaking form of physical comedy can do, you just want to laugh in good faith, it's there in Jackass Forever, and it's there in Best and Last. I definitely laughed pretty consistently. I had a good time overall, and there were some pretty nifty twists or embellishments on previous classic stunts and premises I enjoyed a lot, and I do still by and large love these guys, though strangely enough, I think my fondness has grown a lot more for smaller players like McGeehee, their comedic presence, their reactions to these awful, stupid things they let themselves be put through, much more so than, say, more top-billed guys like Knoxville or Steve-O. Though Steve-O still manages to push some incredible limits even at the twilight of the franchise, and in so doing, proves that he can also truly be this kind of extreme physical comedian, this performer, without intoxicants. So bravo on his proving that again. The meta-narrative of the tragedies occurring behind the scenes of Jackass, I think, are something that, at least implicitly, the franchise has kind of become about since the falling out with Margera during Forever, that these guys are growing up in their own horrific way and moving on from past crutches. When Knoxville jokes in the film, 30 years and we still haven't learned a goddamn thing, that's honestly a pretty ironically false statement, another part of the meta-narrative joy of Jackass, in which you also see, I think, very well explored with Best and Last, especially in interstitial interview moments that are a lot more calm and earnest and sensitive than in previous films where it was usually all just more harassment and pranks and vulgarity. You know, these guys have always, in fact, been learning throughout the process of making Jackass. From the very beginning, some of the funniest Jackass bits were the ones where the stunt didn't work initially and they had to figure it out. They had to learn how to pull off this stuff. And Knoxville and Tremaine's spectacular ambitions certainly haven't waned. The final explosive stunt sequence that they send us out with is pretty ingenious. It's an homage to the opening stunt of the first Jackass film, but where it concludes is honestly just kind of so dark and even disturbing in its humor that it becomes pretty damned poetic. Best and Last starts off on the best note possible, with archival footage of a deleted segment from Knoxville's very first proto-Jackass stunt, where he was testing police gear on himself, the very video that got Tremaine's attention and sparked the idea for the show, in which this skinny, awkward, tweaky-looking white guy who's barely 30 goes out into a remote embankment with his cameraman and some unseen friend who is just begging them to stop and get out of there the whole time, as Knoxville fires a pistol directly into his lower rib cage while wearing a Kevlar vest. And the sequence isn't funny. It's not funny. It's really, really scary and disturbing. Best and Last really does something really challenging here with how it opens. It takes advantage of its core audience's deep affection built up over some 26 years of knowing Knoxville and subverts it. It recontextualizes Jackass itself from the start as this thing that might not have happened because Knoxville could have easily killed himself in that very video. Not that he hasn't taken some pretty close calls in the intervening decades, but those were always in the context of a controlled risk, which only became more controlled over time, and as Knoxville and Tremaine's visions for stunts became more elaborate. Here, this is just a bunch of modern slacker outlaws in the wilds of LA, and if the serious point weren't enough, while the iconic skull and crossbones warning that opens and closes every Jackass film just warns you not to imitate the stunts being done by professionals. The subtitle over this archival footage is more pleading with its viewers. It straight up is telling you, please do not do this, you will probably kill yourself. The very way that Jackass jumped off could have been the end of the life of, if not the world's most revered performance artist, then at least one that really has earned that affection from his fans by showing the lengths to which he's willing to go to not just amuse them, but to impress them, to take them in directions of not just extremes, but ideas of physically intimate friendship in the context of masculinity that they might not have gone to or explored otherwise. I was very reticent about the pitch that Best and Last would partially be a clip show of sorts from Jackass Past, but besides them mostly being previously unused or underused takes from past films, I gotta say that they are utilized with remarkable effectiveness, especially with the repetition of that theme, not just of what could have been lost all along the way of this journey, but what has been lost, of course, with the absence of both Dunn and Margera. Now, a lot of people would see Margera's absence from the new material for the film as a positive, despite his top billing. Margera's fan base never really managed to cross over with the same people who really went for the escapist camaraderie of Jackass. At least I always got the impression, and when I was younger, I would have certainly agreed, that Margera was annoying, clearly spoiled, and sometimes even seemed to come off more as a bully who could never take it quite as good as he dished it out, and usually in much less imaginative ways that inevitably put him in the shadow of Knoxville for a lot of folks watching. But as I've grown up myself, I do have to admit that part of what also makes Best and Last such a comedic and sensitive improvement on Forever is that it incorporates Margera through archival materials in a way that I think is an earnest, sincere attempt to pay homage to him despite the breakup, to really show once and for all that no, if anything, there's a certain feeling of loss for Margera, too, that can't escape the scrutiny that it was probably he who was more picked on, per se, than anybody in the cast. And that, again, going back to that whole escapist fantasy of Jackass, what it represented and spoke to about the desire of so many boys and young men for this kind of intimate camaraderie. If he came off the worst, it was probably because he and Dunn were the most desperate to please, were the most emphatic in trying to push their limits, following Knoxville's lead. They were the most trusting and sincere, and that's probably why both of them broke as hard as they did. It's time to get to the real meat and potatoes of what it means to grow up, not just with, but from this franchise. No matter how much I may love it, so that future generations of boys and younger men can learn from me and not just copy me, not just repeat my mistakes, let's lead off with less testy subject matter, less discourse stuff, because if what you liked about Jackass Forever was just the consistency of humor and the warmness of that feeling of being with the crew again, you got that and better with Best and Last. This is a far superior, false conclusion to the Jackass series. Let's be real, it ended with 3D. But if what you didn't like about Jackass Forever was this completely phoned-in attempt to pass the torch to a new generation of physical comedians and performance artists, you get that and worse with Best and Last, because holy shit, these kids are still basically either useless or unbearable. Look, none of this is personal. I am just kind of being an old man shaking his cane from his front porch at these fucking punk kids I don't recognize and just reactively don't like them because I'm literally not even remotely close to the generational cohort that made them internet famous and thus apparently worth scouting by Tremaine. But as with all things when it comes to the internet, I'm not quite sure if any of these guys actually are natural internet celebrities or if they've just managed to scrape a big enough cut out of the revolving door of algorithm reinforced engagement to be successful without any considerable amount of people actually liking them from an audience perspective, are actually as parasocially invested in these new guys like they were for the core elder Jackass group. Even in the case of Zach Holmes and Jasper Dolphin, who had previously been in their own limited stunt and sketch shows, the latter produced by Tremaine himself, these kids are demonstrably influencers rather than performers. And that plague of look at me absolutely destroys every interaction between the elder cast and everybody in the new class. Whether it's Sean Poopy's McInerney, who was really more of a travel vlogger and actual extreme sports personality than a stunt performer, or Rachel Wolfson, who was just a stand-up comedian and podcaster who only participated in 2 stunts in forever and literally just stands around watching the guys do their dumb shit in best and last. Again, not with any personal malice. McInerney sort of typifies everything that's fundamentally wrong with even the concept of passing the torch in Jackass, because merely the fact that you found anybody who is as explicitly eager to please Knoxville and be part of the crew undermines the entire comedic potential of these stunts and sketches. If these kids have any originality of their own, it's certainly not on display in Best and Last. They aren't being coaxed and with by Knoxville in the same way as the classic crew were. They are just way too happy to be there. That's the whole beauty of the complex emotions Jackass stirs, that these guys are simultaneously so excited and willing to participate, to join in on the fun when it's their turn to laugh at someone else, but are also inevitably miserable to be there, questioning their entire lives up to that point. There's a point in this movie where McGeehee seems to have a brief, full-blown psychic break where he just walks off the set and all we see is security camera footage of him covered in offal and walking into the streets barefoot and making these vague whining noises like you make when you have an embarrassing, intrusive memory that you're trying to shout out, except that embarrassing memory is this guy's whole life. Holmes is used more as a fat guy prop in this film than anything, and McInerney is just so easy. He's so unfazed by things. He's so boring in how he not only gets ready for the bits, but how he reacts in the moment, because McGeehee only took this line of work because he had nothing else. McInerney really wants to be a part of Jackass more than anything, and it fucking sucks. It's boring. It's not interesting. There's no tension to it. You can't blame any of them, least of all Wolfson, who is clearly just as lost as to what her purpose in Jackass is supposed to be as anyone else, because even putting a woman in the Jackass main cast heightens the contradiction that if you did anything like what you put Margera or Steve-O or Dunn or now McInerney and Holmes and Dolphin through, if you did that to Wolfson, oh no, we're uncovering the pervasive grooming and rape culture at the heart of hegemonic masculinity. Alright, time to close things out with some discourse. As far as the best and worst of Best and Last, the best piece of archival footage shown in the film is the one that pays homage to Dunn and, of course, takes us back to the closing prank of the first movie, in which Dunn, then just 29 years old, stuffs a toy car wrapped in a condom up his rectum, walks into an X-ray technician's office pretending to be a college kid who blacked out at a frat house. Yeah, remember that? I remember that. That wasn't a good bit. Heck, the darkest part about how it went over in the original film and how it's now simply reprinted into Best and Last isn't even the implications of a sexual assault joke. It's that the X-ray technician himself, just this old fossil first-generation immigrant guy, he literally takes Dunn by the shoulders and tells him to never tell anybody, to just pretend it all never happened, to just learn from his mistakes and move on, while everyone in the office is passing around this X-ray to show everybody, hey, the guy who got a toy car stuck up his ass and doesn't know how or by whom. In its attempt to pay homage to Dunn, Best and Last can't help but betray the hollow lack of integrity that was always going to mire even the most intimate seeming of male bonds occurring in the context of financial gain for humiliation and self-debasement. While conceding how much they have changed as people and in how they approach many sketches and stunts, the Jackass crew is not going out on its own terms. It is succumbing to its own contradictions. It is finally, truly, and non-ironically living up to the term jackass, not because of what these guys do, but because of the values they communicate, how those values were gross then and are exponentially more gross now, made all the more gross because you basically have this Rachel Wolfson stranger just standing by and watching, but never really participating, so she's just screwed over either way. She's either just a prop or a peril constantly bringing down the funometer, or she's like just a living embodiment of why the humor, the values of Jackass aren't just lowbrow. They are, in places, kinda bad. Kinda bad, maybe time to grow up and move on. I'm giving Jackass Best and Last a tepid 3 out of 5. Anyway, I'm getting out of here. Thank you so much for sticking through this whole video, and please don't be a stranger to shouting out in the comments, what did I get right? What did I get wrong? Otherwise, please share, like, subscribe, bell, yada yada. My name is Ian Garcia. This is Devotional Criticism, and this was the New Movie Diary. I'm gonna catch you guys next time.